Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're going back to one of our new friends, Bay State History. Did a reaction to him a few weeks ago, and he actually has now joined the Discord server. The private VTH Discord server has been very active in there, so it's been really cool having him around and getting to know him a little bit. Actually, new video here that we're going to check out from 12 days ago called The Last Photo of Every President Explained. Now, it's got 125,000 views, but he's only got about 5,800 subscribers. Now, we gave him a boost the last time. I think we can do it again. So if you like what you see, please consider clicking on the link down in the description and head over and subscribe to him. We want to encourage our original content creators to keep making great historical content. Let's dive into this one.
There's some sort of morbid curiosity about seeing the final photographs of people before they die. The advent of photography itself is very new in human history, with the American presidency predating it. But with the presidents of the United States being some of the highest profile men on the planet for the last quarter millennia, many of their lives are well documented through the photograph. In today's video, I'm going to...
we're surprisingly blessed, though, in terms of U.S. presidents, in that only the first 5 don't have photographs, and a few of them very nearly lived long enough to be photographed. I mean, once you get to John Quincy Adams, all of our presidents have photographs of them taken.
Taking a look at the final photograph of each and every president, well, besides the first 5 who we don't have photographs of at all. I'll also be explaining the context, time period, and other individuals within the photo where applicable. I want to give a brief disclaimer that for some of these, especially the early ones, a little guesswork has to be done, as we don't have exact dates for every photo ever taken, as great as that would be for us historians.
Right, so and this actually brings us to a larger conversation that I wouldn't mind having right here, and that's that no one knows everything. Every person out there who knows a lot about a topic, there will be people who know way more than you do about that topic. And so inevitably, when you create content for mass consumption on the internet, like a YouTube video, you'll say something and you'll be 95% sure that you're right on that. And there will be someone watching who knows some kernel of a detail that you and most people don't know. And they'll say, ha, you don't know what you're talking about because you didn't say, and then throws out that obscure fact. So it's important to keep that in mind, that everyone's going off of the best information they have available to them, understanding there might be a little bit more information out there that someone else has.
Entirely possible that 1 or 2 of these might be slightly off, but I made my best effort to guess, and I'll explain my reasoning where applicable. Well, there's not much explaining to do beyond that. Without further ado, let's start at the very beginning. I'm gonna cheat just a little bit here, because I don't want to leave out the first 5 presidents altogether. The first president to ever be photographed was William Henry Harrison in 1841, but the oldest surviving photograph of a president is this one of John Quincy Adams from 1843.
So what he means by first president to be photographed is that William Henry Harrison, who was the 9th president, was the first one to be photographed while he was president. And that's because that's right around the time when photography starts to become relatively widespread. First actual photograph taken, I think, was in the 1820s. But it's really when you get to right around 1840 or so that you start to see photography being used significantly. But you have presidents 6, 7, and 8. So John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, who have photos of them taken, just not while they were in office.
All of the first 5 presidents died before the year 1841, but they were still high profile enough to have plenty of portraits and sketches done of them throughout their life, a luxury only granted to the richest and most powerful individuals in society at the time. The final portrait of George Washington, while he was living, was believed to be this one, drawn in November 1799, just weeks before the former president fell ill and died on December 14th of that year.
Yeah, he was only in his, mid to late 60s, around 67. I think, when he died. Maybe he was 69.
Year. The artist was named Charles de Saint-Meminand and used a device called the
Physiognotrace
to create it, a French invention designed to semi-automate the creation of portraits. Washington was in Philadelphia at the time and had been appointed commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army by his successor, President John Adams, to make preparations for a potential war against France, which never fully materialized.
So this is all during what we call the quasi-war with France. So there was a concern, and it was one of our big kind of political issues of the time is potential war with France, and France and England are at war. This is right in the early stages of the Napoleonic Wars. And so the U.S. doesn't have a standing army at this time. We just have militia. And so they decide they're going to create a standing army. But the only way that some people will support the idea of a standing army is if George Washington is the commander-in-chief of that army. But Washington is in his late 60s. He's in poor health. He really just wants to be left alone. He's finally back home in Mount Vernon. And so he's put in charge of the army in name only. And he only agrees to that if Alexander Hamilton is made his second in command as Inspector General. And Hamilton's really the de facto commander-in-chief of the army, which did not sit well with Adams, but it was the only way he could get it to happen.
The portrait is currently housed in a National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland. Speaking of John Adams, this is the final portrait of the second president of the United States. Painted by a man named Gilbert Stuart, who also created this more famous portrait of the president, it was done sometime in the first half of 1826, before Adams died on July 4th of that year. This is pretty much exactly what I would expect a 90-year-old Adams to look like based on his prior portraits.
Can we say, though, how awesome it is that we have an image of John Adams at that age? I mean, you go all the way back to the 1770s, and you're talking about a John Adams who's in middle age, he's early 40s. And so we've got these images of him going all the way up through because he was such a prominent part of our history for the next 50 years.
This is pretty much exactly what I would expect a 90-year-old Adams to look like based on his prior portraits. Today, you can go and see it in the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C.
Great
The
museum.
final portrait of Thomas Jefferson was painted in 1821, 5 years before his death on the exact same day as John Adams, July 4th, 1826. This was painted by a man named Thomas Sully, who traveled to Jefferson's home, Monticello, when the former president was age 78 and in retirement. There is also an expanded version showing Jefferson's full body, with the president holding an unknown document. This one is also available for public viewing at Benjamin Franklin Hall, a part of the American Philosophical Society, which Jefferson was once a member of in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
So I love that he's giving this context, like who painted it and where you can see the painting today. That's really great information.
James Madison was the closest of the original five to be able to get his photo taken, dying in 1836, over a decade after the advent of photography was invented, but before it was a widespread technology used to capture the likeness of important figures. This portrait of him was finished by James Barton Longacre in 1833, 3 years before Madison's death. Madison was 82 in this portrait, and his age shows, but his wife Dolly was reportedly very pleased with Longacre's work. Longacre had a great admiration for...
Yeah, and you see there, we've got a picture of Dolly Madison.
His wife Dolly was reported...
In fact, there's a really cool photo, and I'm wondering if he'll show it, because it might be the last photo of James Polk ever taken. I'll be curious to see. So I won't get into it too much, but there's a photo of Dolly Madison, James Knox Polk, James Buchanan's in that photo. It's really neat.
Reportedly very pleased with Longacre's work. Longacre had a great admiration for Madison, and I'll link below an interesting letter he wrote to the dying president that is excellently articulated, but a little too long to read here today. Today, you can go and see this portrait at the James Madison Museum in Orange, Virginia. James Monroe is our final of the 5 presidents that we only have portraits of, and this is what the final one of him looks like, painted by a man named Chester Harding in 1829, 2 years before Monroe's death in 1831. Monroe would have been either 70 or 71 in this portrait, which is very different than I'm used to imagining him, because I feel like this specific portrait is pretty much the only one I see used in reference to Monroe, which was painted a full 10 years earlier when he would have been 60. You can go and see this
Look good for 60, I think.
one at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Okay, now on to presidents who had actual photographs taken of them. For the rest of the people on this list, I'm going to be looking exclusively at photographs, no longer portraits, with what exception we'll get to soon. With John Quincy Adams, the oldest picture we have of him is this one, taken around 1847 when he would have been about 80 years old. There are actually only 4 known photos of Quincy in existence, and this one from around...
Notice he says Quincy, which is actually how it's pronounced in Massachusetts, so kudos again. Of course, he's Bay State history, so he's a New England guy. I think he might live in New Hampshire. But, yeah. So,
1843 is actually the oldest surviving photograph of any government official. Quincy apparently hated posing for these, so it explains why there aren't very many, in addition to the fact that the technology was very new and he died in early 1848, likely less than a year after this photograph of him. Here's Andrew Jackson just a couple months before his death in 1845. For most of these early photographs, we can't pinpoint an exact day or even month in which they were taken, but we do know this was shortly before he died on June 8th of that year. Jackson would have been either 77 or 78 in this picture, and I will say for being that age, he still had a pretty solid head of hair. Also note his side
epic hair, if you ask me. I mean, fantastic hair.
Vision glasses, something a bit more common at the time, but still relatively rare.
I've never noticed that about that picture, those side vision glasses. That's really cool. I hadn't even noticed that.
his side vision glasses, something a bit more common at the time, but still relatively rare. Van Buren is the first one on this list that I'm not 100% certain about, just because of the lack of information surrounding some of these older photographs, like I mentioned earlier. The picture here is the most commonly accepted final photograph of Van Buren, taken by a prolific photographer named Matthew Brady sometime between 1855 and 1858, making the president somewhere between 72 and 76 at this time. This is a super common photo of Van Buren, and the one I can remember seeing the most whenever he's referenced, but when researching this video, I also found this mysterious photo which I had never seen before. The quality isn't great, but that is clearly Van Buren. However, there is next to no information available about it.
I've never seen that picture. Man, I'm learning a lot right now. This is great.
If anyone knows the context or time frame of this photo, please let us know in the comments, because it very well could be the real last photo of Van Buren. William Henry Harrison is a really weird scenario, because he technically was photographed, but we don't have any surviving original pictures of him. I always just assumed that this image was a photograph of the president, but no, this was actually created in the year 1850, 9 years after Harrison died, and was a restoration photograph of a portrait of him dating to 1840. However, we do know Harrison was definitely photographed on his inauguration day in 1841, which would make it the first photograph of a president ever, but sadly it is now lost media. So, because we don't have any surviving photographs of Harrison, that would make the 1840 portrait the last image of him that we can still see today. He would have either been 66 or 67 in this portrait, and it was just about a year before he died, within 30 days of taking office as president. John Tyler is our next president, and his final photo is also one that is commonly associated with him. This was taken in 1861, likely less than a year before he died on January 18th, 1862. This was around the time of the Civil War beginning, where he was elected in 1861 to the House of Representatives, but not for the Union, for the Confederacy. He ultimately died before he could serve out any of his term, but it's still almost haunting to know that at this time, he was ready to serve a different country than the one he had just been president for a couple decades earlier.
That's really crazy to think about, that a former United States president was elected to the Congress of a nation that was rebelling against the United States. But it's also important to note, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, for example, 100% would have been part of the Confederacy if he had been alive when that happened. It's just the nature of the way he saw politics and the way he saw the world and the way he saw our union. So it makes total sense.
Photo of James K. Polk was taken around February 1849, just a few months before he died on June 15th of that year. Polk was still relatively young, only 53 years old here, and likely died due to cholera, which he probably contracted from contaminated water in Washington, D.C. Which
I talk about this all the time. If you look at that time period from about 1840 to 1870 or so, look at the sheer number of people in government, presidents included, and their families who died while they were in D.C. or shortly after. Polk, Harrison, you're talking about Zachary Taylor, we're talking about one of Abraham Lincoln's sons. It's definitely there was something in the water, quite literally.
Also affected one of his predecessors, William Henry Harrison. He had left office on March 4th, 1849, and at 104 days, has the shortest post-presidency of any president who did not die in office, and the shortest lifespan of any president that was not assassinated. And here is the last image of Zachary Taylor that we have, before he suddenly died about a year into his presidential term on July 9th, 1850. This was actually taken in the White House sometime in 1849, presumably after his term would have started on March 4th of that year.
This is the photo we typically see, is the one of him in his Brigadier General's uniform, or is that a Major General? I can't tell if there's 1 or 2 stars.
No offense to General Taylor, but he looks pretty old and tired here. He was only 63 or 64 at the time. You have to remember the standards of living were objectively much lower even just a century and a half ago, before the advent of modern medicine. Pivoting to a president who I actually think looks pretty good in his older age, we have Millard Fillmore, who served from 1850 to 1853 and went on to have a post-presidency over 20 years long, dying in 1874. We're not sure exactly when this image is from, but it was sometime in the early 1870s, making Fillmore somewhere between 69 and 74 years old here. At this time in history, photography was starting to become increasingly more common and accessible. The first time-lapse series of photos, The Passage of Venus, was created at the same year Fillmore died, and was a major stepping stone into the advent of film, which would become popular in the subsequent decades. Franklin Pierce is one of our more obscure presidents, which explains why I couldn't find a definitive final photo for him.
Well, and he died fairly young, so you're not going to find any of him when he was like older and aging.
Looked at 3 different videos of the final presidential photos here on YouTube for reference, and each one had a different picture attributed to Pierce. Based on my research, I believe this image is the most likely contender for the last image of Pierce before he died at age 64 in 1869. I don't have a date on this beyond late 1860s, making him somewhere between 61 and 64 here, but hey, that's more than I can find on any of the other photos people claim to be the last one of him. Pierce looks sad and tired here, more so than any of his predecessors in their old age, likely due to the tragic death of his young son, strained marriage, and alcoholism, which ultimately led to his own premature death. Here's
really sad story, just in general, Franklin Pierce.
Canon. Once again, we don't have a definitive date here. This was believed to be sometime in the mid to late 1860s. After he had left office in 1861, Buchanan would have been somewhere between 71 and 76 years old at the time this was taken. Also, that is quite the choice for a hairstyle. This photograph of Abraham Lincoln was taken on March 6, 1865. Just 40 days before he was assassinated at Ford's Theater on April 15th. It was taken on the balcony of the White House by a photographer named Henry Franklin Warren, who printed it at a studio in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is actually not far at all from where I live. During my research, I saw this photo falsely attributed to be the last image of Lincoln.
I was going to say, that's typically the one we see, but I think that was taken earlier in 1865.
Times, but this was actually the last formal photograph, meaning he went and posed for it and everything. This one was taken on February 5th, more than a month earlier. This is the final photograph of President Andrew Johnson, who assumed the role of the presidency upon Lincoln's death in April 1865. Johnson would die a little over a decade later, on July 31st, 1875, at the
and he was actually, I think, back in the United States Senate at that point. He was elected to the Senate from Tennessee after he had served as president.
Age of 66. He's also 66 in this image, believed to be taken in either February or March of that year, right around the same time he was sworn into the United States Senate. Yeah, he was one of the select few presidents that went right back to his old job in politics once his term was over, originally serving as a senator from Tennessee from 1857 to 1862, and briefly returning in 1875, a few months before his death.
So in 62, he had left because he became the military governor of Tennessee. He was a loyalist Democrat. Loyalist, I mean, I know that's more of a revolution term, but a war Democrat, somebody who stayed loyal to the Union from a state that seceded to the Confederacy.
We've got one of my all-time favorite people who served as president, Ulysses S. Grant. This one was taken just 4 days before he died on July 23rd, 1885. This was one day after he finished writing his personal memoirs on July 18th, a project that he believed was the only way to save his family from financial ruin upon his death. And
the man literally willed himself to stay alive long enough to do that. I mean, I've often said that Ulysses S. Grant was only good at a couple of things. He was good at being a general. He was good at being a husband and a father. And because of that, he was going to do everything he could to make sure his family was taken care of. And he willed himself through incredible pain. He was in immense amounts of pain because of the throat cancer that he had. He willed himself to finish those memoirs.
Worked, with his wife receiving royalties of almost $16 million in today's money upon their publication. Grant was suffering immense pain from throat cancer during this time, and he knew that he was dying, spending his final days in a family cottage in Mount McGregor, New York, which you can still visit to this day. I would also highly recommend reading Grant's memoirs that he was writing. They're surprisingly very accessible and easy to understand for a publication that's almost 150 years old.
That's absolutely true. I've read memoirs from most of the prominent generals from the Civil War, and his is by far the easiest read. And I don't mean that as an insult to him, that he's like overly simplistic or anything. It's just that his sounds the most like it was written today. Sherman and Longstreet, these guys like try to beat you over the head with how intelligent they are and what their vocabulary is, and they use words that we don't use today. Grant's, it's a very easy read. It's very accessible. That's a great way to put it, and I highly recommend it.
Here's the final photo of Rutherford B. Hayes, and I did say at the beginning of this video that I would explain the other people within the final photos when applicable. It took us a whole 19 presidents to get there, but hey, there are some other people in this one. We know this photo was taken after June 25th, 1889, because of the absence of Hayes' wife, who died on that day, and obviously before Hayes himself died, which was January 17th, 1893, at the age of 70. I saw the year 1890 floated around with this photo, so assuming that's true, Hayes would be either 67 or 68 here. To his far left is his son, Rutherford Platt Hayes. Standing behind him is Lucy Hayes Herron, who was the daughter of a close friend of Hayes and was given the name when she was baptized. Fun fact, Lucy Hayes Herron is the younger sister of Helen Herron Taft, wife of William Howard Taft. Finally, to his right is the president's daughter Fannie Hayes, who looks to be holding a wooden tennis racket. The final photo of James A. Garfield before he was assassinated on July 2nd, 1881, and finally died on September 19th of that year was this one, taken by Charles M. Bell, a prolific presidential photographer. He also captured this famous shot of Chester Arthur, the next president we'll talk about. There were several shots captured during this shoot, and we're not 100% sure of the order of them, but they were all taken in close enough proximity to where I think you get the idea of what the true final photo of Garfield would look like.
And it's interesting, of course, to note that when Garfield becomes president, his beard is much shorter than it had been in most of the other photographs that you see of him. And highly recommend, well, I can't recommend necessarily the accuracy of it because I haven't seen it yet, but definitely worth checking out Death by Lightning when it comes out. I did a review of the trailer for Death by Lightning, which is coming out in just a couple of weeks on Netflix, and it's about the final months of Garfield's life.
Garfield was just 49 years old when these were taken sometime in the first half of 1881. I'm guessing around the time of his inauguration on March 4th. Chester Arthur was another one that was difficult to pinpoint for this list. I found several sources claiming that this was his final photo with little contradiction, but the time frame and context remains a mystery to me. If I had to guess, this was after his presidency was over, because it was believed he was on a camping trip with the man next to him, who was a friend of his.
Now, he died not long after being president. He was actually dying while president. He had something called Bright's disease, which was a common kidney ailment that was often fatal at that time.
Definitely not impossible that this was taken while he was president, but I'd be surprised because he does look a little older to me than he did in his presidential portrait shots. I'm gonna guess he was somewhere between 55 and 57 here. Probably not 57 because he died just 6 weeks after that birthday and was seriously ill beginning in the fall of 1886, which he doesn't appear to be here. Here's Grover Cleveland on March 5th, 1908, not too long before his death on June 24th of that year. He would have been 70 years old here, less than 2 weeks from his 71st birthday, and looks pretty much exactly what I would imagine an older Cleveland to look like.
Yeah.
He's lost some weight since his days in the Oval Office and is sitting at a desk in what I believe to be his personal study. Benjamin Harrison was yet another president with a difficult to pinpoint final photograph, but I believe this one to be the most likely contender. I saw several claims that this famous shot of Harrison was the final image of the man, but I don't believe that to be true, because by most accounts that photo was taken in 1896. In this one, we see Harrison with his daughter, Elizabeth, who was born the next year in 1897.
And yes, you're wondering, he had a daughter that late in life? Well, yeah, when he was president, his wife, the first lady, died while they were in office, and he remarried to a much younger woman and had children very late in life.
She looks to be at least over a year old here, more likely closer to 3 or 4, which would put this photo in 1900 or 1901. Harrison died on March 3rd, 1901 at the age of 67, so I'm going to take a guess and say he's between 64 and 67 here, most likely 66.
Just a personal aside here, and I don't want to pass judgment on anybody who has children late in life, but like I see like people in Hollywood in their 80s having kids, and I just feel as a dad that I find that so irresponsible to basically ensure that your child is going to grow up without their father. And I don't know,
It's entirely possible that this is not the last photo of Harrison, but it's the most recent one I could find where we could at least estimate the time frame with reasonable accuracy. When William McKinley visited the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York on September 6, 1901, he had no idea the visit would ultimately result in his demise. Here we see McKinley on a carriage ride to the Temple of Music attraction at the exposition. There was then this photo captured of him walking up the entrance stairs to his destination, completely unaware of what would happen mere moments later. I believe this is the actual final photograph of the president, who had taken his hat off upon entering the building and is looking forward in the direction of the camera here. Within minutes, he was shot.
Literally a picture of him standing near the spot where he was shot just a couple minutes later. It's one of the most incredible historic photos that we have.
Shot by an anarchist, Leon Czolgosz, but didn't die instantaneously. He survived a further 8 days, and at one point was believed to be making somewhat of a recovery, which
I actually went through because I was curious about this, and I was on newspapers.com going through a bunch of old newspapers. And I was reading the daily headlines, which were all about the president's medical situation. And after like the first day, all the reports were he's improving, he's going to be fine. And that bears out in the fact that Vice President Roosevelt actually goes back. He goes and leaves Buffalo because everybody's like, oh, he's going to be all right. And up until the day before McKinley died, the reports were he's doing great, he's going to be fine. And then boom, the next day, president died. Like, it happened really quickly.
Unfortunately did not come to fruition. The photo of McKinley walking up the steps is especially haunting to me, and this is often attributed as the last photo of the president, likely because it's a lot more cinematic in a way compared to the one where he's inside. McKinley was just 58 years old when he died. For Theodore Roosevelt, I found 2 possible contenders for his final photograph, both taken in the year 1918 with non-specific dates. This first one is at his home on Sagamore Hill on Long Island, New York, but I think this second one is slightly more likely to be the last image of him. I don't really have any concrete reasoning beyond him just looking a bit more frail, but that could easily just just be the way if the photo was framed or any other number of reasons.
There's one, I think, important thing that needs to be mentioned in all of this, and that's that. I mean, he's in his late 50s at that point, but he's always been in poor health. He dealt with asthma growing up, but he also had this issue where he had nearly died on the Amazon after he had left office. But then understand that in the summer of 1918, his youngest son was killed in action in World War I. He was shot down. He was a fighter pilot. And I have no doubt that weighed heavily on him.
Either way, he would only be either 59 or 60 when these photos were captured. Sadly, Roosevelt was taken from us.
There is a photo of him after he died. I would actually, I guess, argue that the last photo of him was when he's laying in the casket. And I can't remember if it's a photo of him before he was buried or if it's a photo of him after he was exhumed, because he was actually exhumed not long after he was buried. But I know there's a photo of him in the casket.
Much too soon. Thankfully, we're now getting into the territory where a lot of these final photos are pretty cut and dry in terms of which one were truly the last. This is the case with William Howard Taft, where we see him here at age 72 in a wheelchair, with two members of what looked to be his medical staff or aides behind him. Taft had lost over 100 pounds since he left the Oval Office 17 years prior, and at least based on this photo, seemed to be in good spirits in his final days. This image is from around February 1930, so just a few weeks before his death on
He's Chief Justice at that point.
March 8th of that year. Here is Woodrow Wilson sometime between August 1923 and January 1924, leaving his home in Washington, D.C. with the help of an unidentified aide. Wilson died on February 3rd, 1924, at the age of 67, making him either 66 or 67 in this photo. However, his health had
Notice how many of these guys are 67. I know that's a big thing with the kids these days.
been in rough shape for 4 years by this point, suffering a severe stroke while he was still in office in 1919 that left him partially paralyzed with cognitive issues. Here's Warren Harding on July 31st, 1923, on the last leg of a trip he was making throughout the west coast of the United States and Canada, starting with Alaska and ending in San Francisco.
Where he
People
died.
observed that he looked tired and ill throughout the journey, and he had been complaining of upper abdominal pain after a series of gaffes during public appearances. Harding's personal physician arranged for him to meet with a leading cardiologist in San Francisco, and in this photo, Harding is just arriving off a train to the city and walking to a limousine, which would take him to the Palace Hotel, where he would die 2 days later of congestive heart failure. Also in the photo is the Harding administration's Surgeon General, Charles Sawyer, Harding's personal secretary, George Christian, and Harding's wife, Florence Harding. He was only 57 years old when he died. The last photo of Calvin Coolidge was taken during a campaign trail speech in 1932 in front of the Republican National Committee, which we know today as the Republican National Convention. Coolidge himself was not running this year. Instead, it was his former Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, running for re-election. Coolidge is addressing the RNC and endorsing Hoover's bid here, and would be his final public appearance before his passing on January 5th, 1933.
That's another one I don't know that I've ever seen, and I wonder if there's an existing recording of that speech, because you see NBC there, so it was obviously going out over the radio waves as well.
Coolidge would have just been 60 years old here, another president who died relatively young. The last image of Herbert Hoover is a pretty self-explanatory one. Here, he's paying a visit to the sitting president at the time, JFK, in 1963. JFK was 46 at the time, while Hoover was 89, making him the longest-lived president since John Adams over a century prior. But, tragically, Kennedy would be the first two of the men in this picture to die. Hoover lived for almost a full year after the Kennedy assassination, dying at the age of 90 on October 20th, 1964, just about 200 days shy of beating John Adams' record to become the longest-lived president at the time. These two photos
at the time, because I think it's now Ronald Reagan. No, it'd be Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter almost made it to 100.
Photos of Franklin D. Roosevelt were both taken on April 11th, 1945, inside his personal retreat, the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. They were taken as reference photos for a portrait that was going to be painted by an artist named Elizabeth Shomatoff. This is what that portrait ended up looking like. You can tell it remained unfinished. Roosevelt was just 63 years old when he died the next afternoon of a cerebral hemorrhage, but you can tell that his unprecedented 12 years in office overseeing the Great Depression and World War II had taken their toll on him physically. April 1940.
Plus, he had health problems anyway. I mean, ever since the 1920s when he had been crippled by what we usually say polio, but I've read recently people have said maybe it wasn't polio, that it was something else. I don't know.
1945 was an insane month in world history. You had FDR's death on the 12th, Mussolini's on the 28th, and Hitler's on the 30th. If only FDR had lived a few more months to see his country's victory in their greatest challenge to date. Apologies for the extremely low quality of this image, but here you can barely make out Harry S. Truman being discharged from Research Medical Center in Kansas City, Missouri. That's him getting inside the car, partially obscured by the door. Truman had been in the hospital for 15 days, and upon his discharge on July 17th, 1972, 1972, he returned home for a few months until he was admitted again in December with pneumonia. He would ultimately die on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88, the same age he was in this discharge photo. Similar to Herbert Hoover, the last photo of Dwight Eisenhower was him with the sitting president at the time, this time literally sitting down. That fella is Richard Nixon, Ike's former vice president.
Yep.
Eisenhower had been
And Nixon's daughter married Ike's grandson.
in and out of Walter Reed Medical Center for a good chunk of time leading up to his death on March 28, 1969. And this specific photo was taken on February 2nd, so Nixon had been president for less than 2 weeks at the time. Eisenhower was 78 when he died, and at least here, I think he looks pretty solid for his age. I just want to give a brief warning before this next section that this is the most disturbing image on this list. Nothing graphic is shown, but if you're sensitive towards this kind of stuff and the descriptions that come alongside it, feel free to skip to this timestamp where I start talking about Lyndon B. Johnson. Okay, all good? Here is John F. Kennedy in the famous Zapruder film, the video that captured the president's motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, on the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. Kennedy was shot twice, first in the back with the bullet exiting his throat, and second in the head, the fatal shot. It's believed that after the first shot, Kennedy was fully aware and conscious, but the second shot near instantly killed him. Frame 313 of the Zapruder film is the one that shows Kennedy getting shot in the head, so here we have frame 312, literal milliseconds before Kennedy's life was taken at the age of 46, the youngest of any president in American history. It's possible and even likely that Kennedy was technically alive for a few frames after this one, but since we can't pinpoint the definitive moment where he lost his life, I'll go with frame 312 here for simplicity's sake. This makes this photo the closest one to the death of a president of any image on this list, which makes sense considering Kennedy's death itself was the only one captured on film.
And I guess second to that would be the one of McKinley. Well, no. It's no, because that's actually about a week before he actually died, even though it was taken right before he was shot.
Other people in the car with
So it'd probably be, would it be the one of Grant that was taken just a couple of days before he died?
Kennedy are his wife, Jackie, tightly grasping him after he'd been shot for the first time here, Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie Connally, Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, and another Secret Service agent driving the car, William R. Greer. Fun fact, Nellie Connally was the one to live the longest out of anyone in this car, dying at the age of 87 all the way in 2006. Alright.
And even John Connolly, I think, lived till was it the 90s he died?
On to a lighter subject material for our next photo. Here's Lyndon B. Johnson on January 16, 1973, at the age of 64. The man who he's shaking hands with is John Cena.
And his name is John Cena!
I mean, William P. Hobby Jr. Hobby was the lieutenant governor for a record 18 years, and this was his very first day on the job. He had been part of Johnson's administration, and his father, William P. Hobby Sr., was governor of Texas and also knew Johnson. Hobby Jr. is actually still alive as of the recording of this video, and is about to turn 94 years old.
Wow.
Anyways, Johnson was in poor health for decades of his life. He had his first heart attack at age 46, and was a heavy smoker that refused to follow diets his doctors would put him on. In 1968, he was told by his doctor that he had about 5 years left to live, which led Johnson not to seek re-election that year, and this was...
I feel like there's a few other reasons he didn't seek re-election that year, but that certainly could have played into it.
Exactly accurate. He died 6 days after this photo was taken from another heart attack. Alright, we're on to our last 5 presidents. Richard Nixon died on April 22nd, 1994, and I couldn't find an exact date on this photo, but I believe it was sometime between April 18th and 21st. He's in New York City here, and on his way back to New York Presbyterian Hospital in Manhattan, where he was being treated for a stroke that he had on the 18th. Interestingly enough, the wife of his old political rival was in the same hospital at the same time, none other than Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy, who by this time
I was going to say, she died around the same time of cancer.
Actually, Jackie Kennedy Onassis was also being treated, and the two died just 3 weeks apart. Nixon was 81 years old in this image when he died. Ford is the final president on our list to have their last photo be one with another president. In this case, that's George W. Bush facing him. Bush visited Gerald Ford at his home in Rancho Mirage, California, for just over an hour on April 23rd, 2006. Here's
I think Ford looks good there for his age. I mean, he looks fantastic, really.
another photo from that day, showing the two men more clearly, and President Ford's wife, Betty. Ford was an astounding 92 years old at this time, and I will say he looked pretty good for his age.
I think he looks fantastic for 92. If I make it to 92, I hope I look that good.
Ford,
You know who looks really good for being in his 90s is William Shatner. Holy cow, have you seen that guy? Crazy.
passed away 8 months later on December 26, 2006, at the age of 93, peacefully surrounded by his family in his home. Jimmy Carter is the most recent president on this list to be taken from us. On December 29, 2024, at the age of 100, an unprecedented milestone for a president to reach in longevity. These two images were taken on his 100th birthday on October 1st, 2024, where he made a brief and quiet public appearance to witness a military flyover tribute to him in Plains, Georgia, surrounded by
I feel terrible about that. I mean, because I always found Jimmy Carter to be a great person, even though I don't think he was the best president. A lot of that was circumstantial, wasn't necessarily his fault. But the end of his life, obviously, living as long as he did and being as ill as he was, it's very sad to see that some of those photos of him taken at the end of his life when he very clearly didn't have much quality of life.
Family and caretakers. He definitely looks like a 100-year-old guy here, but I'm glad of everyone on the list, he was the one to live the longest. Say what you will about his presidency, but the humanitarian work he did in the following 4 decades was nothing short of incredible.
100%.
Here is Ronald Reagan, also on his birthday, this time his 89th, on February 6, 2000. He's with his wife Nancy here. And by the late 90s and early 2000s, Reagan was suffering from severe Alzheimer's, having difficulty remembering those around him and that he was ever president of the United States. I'll go out and say Reagan might have had the best head of hair I've ever seen on a dude in his late 80s. He was actually still alive for over 4 years after this photo was taken, passing on June 5th, 2004.
And it may be that there are other photos of him that are privately kept by the family, but this is the most recent public photo we have of him.
Of pneumonia with Alzheimer's complications at the age of 93. In my opinion, it's more than likely that there are plenty more pictures of Reagan after the date, but those have been kept private by his family if they do exist, and that's more than understandable. The last president we'll be covering today is George H.W. Bush, who died on November 30th, 2018 at the age of 94. The longest-lived president up to that point. Here's what's believed to be the last photo of him, voting in the 2018 midterm elections. This would place the photo on November 6th, but I couldn't find a definitive source on this, and it's fully possible he's voting early here. But for simplicity, I will say this was most likely the day of. Next to him is his service dog, Sully, who's a Labrador Retriever that serves disabled veterans. Sully is actually still alive as of the recording of this video, at age 9. I'm not positive who's to Bush's right there, maybe an aide or a friend. And there you have it, the final photographs of all 40 United States presidents who have passed away. For reasons that should be very obvious, at least in the year 2025, I omitted Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden, and Trump here, but the rest are all present. Which photo did you find the most interesting or surprising? If you enjoyed this video and want to see some more content on American presidents, I've got plenty on the channel. I'd recommend this video I did on obscure and fake presidents that I mentioned earlier. Also be sure to subscribe. October is President's Month here on Bay State History, and this is the second of 5 videos I'll have coming out each Wednesday of the month. Next week I'll be sharing 7 random facts about every US president. I hope to see you there.
Okay, well, once again, just like the first video we did of Bay State History, top-notch stuff, really well-researched, great information. Where he wasn't sure or there was some doubt about things, he provided the alternate ideas behind that. He gave context, gave detailed information about the photos. Really well done. I definitely recommend you check out his channel and subscribe if you haven't already. Let's get that number up to 10,000, shall we? Thanks for watching.